When you think about how we usually consume ancient history, there's this massive expectation of scale.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, you open a history book or you watch a documentary, and you're just immediately conditioned to look for the big, sweeping, cinematic shots.
Right, the macro view.
Yeah, exactly. You expect to see vast armies colliding, empires rising and falling, monuments being built by tens of thousands of people.
Kings sitting on golden thrones, making decisions that alter the map.
It's loud. It's incredibly dramatic. And for the most part, historians just kind of point at the battlefield or the ruins of a palace and say, right there, that is where history was made.
Yeah, it's the classic top-down view of human events. It focuses entirely on the visibility of power.
Right.
And is really concerned with the people sitting at the absolute top of the pyramid, which honestly is understandable. Those are the events that leave the biggest craters in the archaeological record.
Right. It's clean. It's easy to track. And it gives us this illusion that history is only ever shaped by the people holding the reins of state power. Right.
But what happens when that wide-angle lens is just completely useless? Like, what happens when you step away from the palaces and the battlefields and you zoom way, way in on a tiny, ancient, rural, agrarian village?
You find a completely different kind of historical landscape.
Yeah.
One that is incredibly quiet.
Yeah.
It's hidden. It is the absolute definition of history being made in the margins, far away from anyone who considers themselves important.
And that is exactly where we are heading today. We are taking a really comprehensive look at an incredible piece of analysis. It's a survey of Ruth, authored by Chris Velasquez.
It's a brilliant breakdown.
It really is. And the mission for our deep dive today is to unpack how a very brief, seemingly straightforward ancient text about a destitute widow is actually this highly crafted, subversive masterpiece of literature and law and theology.
It really is a masterpiece. But unfortunately, it's text that is incredibly easy to overlook or just misunderstand, simply because of how it's usually presented to us today. Oh, totally. If you grew up around this story, you probably got the highly sanitized, simplified Sunday school version.
It's a flannel graph.
Yes, the flannel graph version where everyone is just being super nice to each other in a wheat field.
Right.
But we're entirely bypassing that today. We're looking at the raw text. We are going to explore the fierce legal maneuvering, the absolute brutal reality of economic survival in the ancient world, and the hidden, almost microscopic workings of providence in this narrative.
Which is so much more compelling than the sanitized version.
It is. I was thinking about it earlier, and if you look at the other historical texts from this era, things like the Book of Judges or the Histories of the Kings, they read like these sprawling, violent, big-budget historical epics.
Right.
But the Book of Ruth, it reads like a brilliant, critically acclaimed indie film.
That is a really highly accurate way to frame it. I like that.
It's this incredibly tight, intimate story. And the magic of it is how it quietly, almost invisibly, connects an era of massive bloody chaos to the founding of a royal dynasty.
The line of King David.
Exactly. And it does all of this while focusing its camera entirely on a marginalized immigrant woman who has absolutely zero societal power whatsoever.
And as we dig into the materials today, that is really the core focus we need to keep coming back to, exploring why this specific text matters so much.
Right.
Because this story forces you to question your fundamental assumptions about power. It asks you to reconsider what vulnerability actually means and how history actually moves forward.
Yeah.
The text is making a very bold claim. It suggests that the timeline of human redemption isn't just propelled by kings drawing lines on a map. It's propelled by ordinary, forgotten people making choices of extraordinary, costly loyalty.
So to really appreciate the quiet rebellion of this indie film, we have to understand the massive, chaotic blockbuster that was playing in the theater right next door.
Yes, the context.
Right. We need to talk about the world before the story even begins. Where exactly does this book sit in the historical and literary timeline? Because context changes everything.
It absolutely does. And to understand the context, you first have to look at where the book is physically placed in the canon of Scripture, because that placement tells a story all on its own.
Okay.
If you open a standard Christian Bible, you'll find the Book of Ruth placed immediately after the Book of Judges and just before the books of Samuel.
And that's not just like alphabetical order. That's a very deliberate editorial choice.
Highly deliberate.
Yeah.
It acts as a canonical bridge. The Book of Judges, particularly the final chapters, chapters 17 through 21, outlines a society in a state of absolute terrifying moral collapse.
It's dark.
Extremely dark. It is an era defined by tribal decentralization. You have local warlords, you have systemic violence, and you have incredibly weak national integration. The tribes of Israel are basically tearing themselves and each other apart.
Yeah, the ending of Judges is arguably one of the grimmest, darkest sequences in ancient literature.
Without a doubt.
There's that haunting refrain that repeats throughout those final chapters. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes.
Exactly. Pure, unchecked chaos.
Yeah.
So canonically, Ruth is placed there to soften that horrific ending. It functions as a bridge that leads us out of the chaos of the warlord era and introduces the subtle, quiet emergence of the monarchy.
Specifically, the Davidic monarchy.
Right, which will eventually take center stage when we get to 1 Samuel.
Mm-hmm.
It shows that even in an era where everyone is doing what is right in their own eyes, there are still pockets of profound faithfulness.
But the survey notes that the Hebrew Bible treats its placement entirely differently, right?
Yes. In the traditional Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, Ruth is located in a section called the Ketuvim, which translates to the writings.
Okay.
This section is entirely different from the historical chronicles. The writings are books that probe deep questions about wisdom, about how providence works, about suffering and daily life.
So books like Psalms, Proverbs.
Job, Ecclesiastes, exactly. Ruth sits in that philosophical company.
That reframes how you read it completely. It's less about logging historical dates and more about asking, how do we live a good life in a broken world?
Precisely. Furthermore, within the Ketuvim, it is classified as one of the Megillot, or the Five Scrolls. And traditionally, it is assigned to be read out loud in the synagogue during the festival of Shavuot, which is the Feast of Weeks.
And Shavuot is fundamentally a harvest festival, isn't it?
It is.
Which makes total sense, given that the entire middle of this story takes place in a barley field during the harvest.
Exactly. The thematic tie-in is perfect.
But setting aside where it sits on the bookshelf, when was the story actually written down? Because the notes we have dive into a pretty intense scholarly debate about the dating of the text.
Oh, it is one of the most fiercely debated topics in biblical scholarship.
Really?
Yeah. The narrative itself announces its setting right out of the gate. The very first verse says it takes place in the days when the judges ruled. So the setting is the late Bronze or early Iron Age.
Okay.
However, determining when the final literary composition, like the highly polished structured story we have today, was actually put to parchment is a completely different question.
So just because a movie is set in the 1920s doesn't mean it was filmed in the 1920s?
Exactly. The source material notes that many modern reference works actually argue for a post-exilic date.
Okay, so after the exile.
Right. That would place its final editing and composition somewhere in the late 5th or 4th century BCE.
Which is hundreds of years after the events supposedly took place. I mean, Israel has already had its kings, lost its kingdom, been exiled to Babylon, and is now trying to rebuild.
Right. And if we follow the argument for that late composition, it means the book was likely shaped by Judahite scribes living in Jerusalem after returning from the Babylonian exile.
Wow.
And you have to imagine their mindset. They are a traumatized community. They're reflecting deeply on their identity. They're asking questions like, who actually belongs to the people of God?
Right.
Who gets to live in this land? What constitutes true covenant loyalty? Are foreigners allowed in?
Because at that time, leaders like Ezra and Nehemiah were pushing for very strict ethnic purity, telling the Israelites to send away their foreign wives.
Yes. So many scholars argue these scribes were using this much older, beloved family story about a heroic foreign woman to speak directly to Israel's current crisis of identity.
That's fascinating.
It was a subtle, brilliant way to say, hey, before we start building walls to keep foreigners out, let's remember that our greatest king, David, had a Moabite great-grandmother who was more faithful than anyone else.
It's a theological counter-narrative.
Exactly.
But the survey also mentions that this late date isn't a universally held consensus, right?
No, it's definitely not. The survey fairly points out that other linguistic and historical scholars argue for a much earlier date.
Like when?
Perhaps pre-exilic, during the height of the monarchy, or during the transition into the exile. The Hebrew used in the text has elements that look very old, but also elements that look later, which makes it a really tricky puzzle.
I see.
But regardless of the exact century the ink dried, the text is doing heavy theological lifting.
Which naturally brings up the biggest question people have when reading ancient texts. Like, is it real? Did this actually happen?
The classic historicity question.
Right. The survey tackles the historicity of the text through the lens of archaeology. And I really love how honest the source material is about what archaeology can and cannot do for us in this specific instance.
It requires a lot of intellectual honesty.
Yeah.
We have to state clearly there is absolutely no direct physical archaeological artifact that names Ruth or Naomi or Boaz.
Right.
We haven't excavated Elimelech's ancient mailbox in Bethlehem. We don't have a tax receipt with their names on it.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we don't have a single artifact proving these specific characters existed, why do historians and scholars trust the historical settings so much? Like, why not just write the whole thing off as a beautifully written ancient fairy tale, a complete work of fiction?
It's a crucial question.
Yeah.
And the survey synthesizes this beautifully.
Huh.
The answer lies in the difference between macroarchaeology and microarchaeology.
Okay, explain that.
While we do not have the birth certificates of the specific actors in this story, we have absolute undeniable proof of the authenticity of the stage they're acting on. The historical credibility of the Book of Ruth comes from how perfectly, almost flawlessly, the book reflects the very specific socio-legal realities of the ancient southern Levant during the Iron Age.
So the background details are just too accurate for someone to have just made them up out of thin air hundreds of years later without knowing the reality of that world.
Exactly.
What kind of proof are we talking about?
Well, the survey highlights two major pieces of evidence that ground the story in historical reality. First, there is the Mesha stele, which is also known as the Moabite stone.
I've heard of this. It's a massive black stone slab, right?
Yes, it's a basalt monument. It's a royal inscription dating back to the mid-9th century BCE. It was discovered in the 1800s in Dibon, which is in modern-day Jordan, and it currently resides in the Louvre in Paris.
Okay.
This stone is monumental for biblical historians. It contains a lengthy inscription by King Mesha of Moab, boasting about his military victories over Israel.
But wait, why does a boastful military monument matter for a quiet story about a widow?
Because it confirms the geopolitical reality of the world Ruth comes from. It proves that Moab wasn't some mythical, fictional land made up to serve as a fairy tale backdrop.
It was real.
Moab was a real, politically active, highly literate West Semitic kingdom. The language inscribed on the stone is incredibly close to biblical Hebrew.
Really?
Yes, it shows that Moab and Israel shared borders, shared linguistic roots, and were deeply entangled culturally, even though they are often in bitter conflict.
Right.
It proves that the cross-border migration we see in the Book of Ruth was a very real, lived phenomenon.
Okay, so the geography and the politics check out. What's the second piece of evidence?
The second piece of evidence brings us right to the hometown of the story. The survey mentions the Calais Al-Jama necropolis.
A necropolis,
Yeah.
as in a massive burial site.
Exactly. It's an Iron Age burial complex dating from the 8th to the 7th century BCE. And crucially, it is located just a couple of kilometers south of the Church of the Nativity in modern Bethlehem.
Oh, wow. Right in the neighborhood.
Right in the neighborhood. And what this necropolis proves is that there was sustained, active, multi-generational Iron Age occupation around Bethlehem.
It wasn't just a random spot on a map.
No, it wasn't just an empty field. There was a thriving, structured agrarian community living there, burying their dead, and maintaining complex local traditions.
Okay.
So when the Book of Ruth describes the agrarian village life, the seasonal harvest, the cross-border migrations between Judah and Moab to escape famine, and the intricate local legal procedures at the city gates,
It all fits.
all of these elements fit perfectly with what we now know of the ancient southern Levant from the archaeological record. It is a highly credible, authentic world.
You know, I think of it like watching a historical drama set in 1920s New York City. Like, you might be watching a completely fictional mobster navigate the city. We don't have historical proof that this specific mobster existed. But if the cars they drive, the slang they use, the layout of the speakeasies, the clothing, and the political tensions between the immigrant neighborhoods are all perfectly historically accurate, the story carries a profound weight of truth.
Exactly.
It tells you something deeply real about 1920s New York, even if the protagonist is a composite.
That is a brilliant analogy. The environment is absolutely real.
Yeah.
And because the environment is real, the stakes of that environment are incredibly high.
Yeah.
The danger is real, which brings us right into the cultural and sociological reality of the text itself.
Let's talk about those stakes, the survival aspect. The source points out an incredible dark irony right at the very beginning of the text. The story starts in the town of Bethlehem. Now, if you translate Bethlehem from Hebrew, it literally means house of bread.
Right. Beth meaning house, Lehem meaning bread.
Right. But the house of bread is experiencing a severe famine. There is no bread.
Yeah. The irony is stark.
And this ecological disaster forces a man named Elimelech to make a desperate choice. He packs up his wife, Naomi, and his two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and they leave their ancestral land. They migrate east, crossing the border into the neighboring country of Moab to survive as resident aliens. They become immigrants.
And this migration sets up the central, devastating crisis of the entire narrative. Because while they are living in Moab, the unthinkable happens. Elimelech, the patriarch of the family, dies.
Leaving Naomi alone with her two sons in a foreign country.
Yes. The two sons eventually marry local Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. So they were trying to put down roots. But then tragedy strikes again. About 10 years later, both sons, Mahlon and Chilion, die as well.
It's just an unfathomable amount of grief.
It is. This leaves Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah as three widows living together in a foreign land. And we have to pause the narrative here because the survey makes a very, very concerted effort to explain that we absolutely cannot look at this situation through a modern 21st century lens.
Right. When we think of widowhood today, we primarily think of the profound emotional and psychological devastation of losing a spouse, which of course was true then as well.
Of course.
But the implications were so much broader.
Infinitely broader. In the ancient Near Eastern patriarchal society, widowhood was not just an emotional tragedy. It was a severe, immediate, life-threatening economic crisis.
It was an economic death sentence.
Almost certainly.
Yeah.
In this cultural framework, a woman's social security, her legal standing in the community, her access to resources, and her right to own or work land, all of it depended entirely on her connection to a male household.
Wow.
It depended on husbands, on adult sons, and on extended male kinship networks. There were no bank accounts to fall back on.
No life insurance.
No life insurance policies. There was no state-sponsored pension.
If you didn't have a man attached to your name, you basically didn't exist in the eyes of the economy.
Exactly. You fell completely through the floorboards of society. When the men in this family die, Naomi and Ruth are pushed to the absolute extreme margins. They have no land in Moab. Naomi's land back in Judah is abandoned and likely repossessed or lying fallow.
They have nothing.
They have no income, and they have no male protectors. In the ancient world, a woman in this position was completely exposed to starvation, exploitation, and violence.
It's terrifying. But the survey also points out that the society back in Israel wasn't entirely without a safety net, right? There were legal structures meant to protect the vulnerable, even if they were difficult to access or enforce.
Yes, and this is where the genius of the ancient Israelite covenant law comes into play. The text of Ruth relies heavily on the reader understanding two specific legal provisions that were designed to catch people exactly like Naomi and Ruth.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, there is the law of gleaning.
How did gleaning actually work in practice?
According to the legal codes found in Leviticus 19 and Deuteronomy 24, landowners in Israel were strictly instructed on how to harvest their fields. When you reaped your grain, you were forbidden from harvesting the very edges, the corners of your field.
Okay.
And if you dropped a bundle of grain while you were working, you were forbidden from going back a second time to pick it up.
That seems counterintuitive to running a profitable farm. Like, you're literally leaving money on the table.
Deliberately so. That leftover grain, the margins of the harvest, was legally reserved for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the resident alien.
Wow.
It was an ancient built-in welfare system. It wasn't charity that a landowner could choose to give or withhold based on their mood. It was a legal right possessed by the poor.
But it wasn't a handout either. You had to work for it. If I understand correctly, gleaners would follow behind the professional harvesters, bending over in the hot sun all day, just picking up the scraps.
Precisely. It was back-breaking, exhausting work. And it carried a dual stigma and blessing. Well, on one hand, it signaled extreme poverty. You were reduced to picking up leftovers just to survive. But on the other hand, it signaled divine provision, because God had encoded care for the vulnerable directly into the agricultural rhythms of the nation.
That's the first safety net. What's the second one? The survey spends a lot of time on this one, and it feels much more complicated. The concept of the goel.
The goel. This is one of the most important concepts in the entire Hebrew Bible. It translates to the kinsman redeemer.
What exactly was a kinsman redeemer expected to do?
A goel was a close male relative, a brother, an uncle, a cousin, who had the legal and moral obligation to step in and protect the extended family's interests when disaster struck.
Okay.
If a family member plunged into deep poverty and had to sell their ancestral land to survive, the goel was supposed to step in and buy it back, to redeem it, so the land stayed within the family's inheritance.
Because land in ancient Israel wasn't just real estate. It was your inheritance from God. It was your identity.
Exactly. It was inextricably linked to your place in the covenant. Furthermore, if a family member became so destitute that they had to sell themselves into debt slavery, the Goel was the one who paid the debt to buy their freedom.
Wow.
And crucially for our story, the role of the Goa intersected with the laws regarding household continuity and preserving the family name.
Now, the survey references the scholarship of Brad Embry here, and this is where the legal mechanics get fascinating but also really murky, because a lot of people just assume what happens in Ruth is a standard levirate marriage. Can you explain what levirate marriage is and why Embry argues it's actually more complicated than that?
It's a great distinction to make. Standard levirate marriage, outlined in Deuteronomy 25, applies specifically to brothers living together. If one brother dies childless, the surviving brother is legally obligated to marry the widow.
Okay.
The first child born from that new union would carry the name and inherit the property of the deceased brother so that his lineage isn't erased from history.
So it's a way of cheating death in a sociological sense. You preserve the dead man's legacy.
Right? But Embry's scholarship points out that the situation in Ruth doesn't perfectly fit the strict levirate law.
Why not?
Because Boaz is not Elimelech's brother. He's an extended relative. He isn't obligated under strict levirate law to marry Ruth.
So what law are they actually using then?
Embry references the ancient legal case of the daughters of Zelophehad, found in the Book of Numbers. Those daughters argue that because their father died with no sons, they should inherit his land so his name wouldn't be lost.
And God agreed with them, right?
Yes, setting a new legal precedent. Embry suggests that what happens in the Book of Ruth is a highly complex, blended legal innovation. It is a mix of the spirit of the levirate duty, providing an heir for the dead, combined with the property laws of the Golim redemption, buying back Elimelech's land.
Man, it's not just a simple standard transaction. It's an incredibly intricate, custom-built legal maneuver. If you've ever tried to navigate a wildly complex probate court today, dealing with estate taxes and inheritance disputes, imagine doing that. But you have no lawyer, you have no money, your bank accounts are frozen, and you are relying entirely on a mix of community goodwill and obscure legal loopholes just to keep a roof over your head.
That is exactly the kind of agonizing vulnerability the text wants you to feel. Their survival is not guaranteed by any stretch of the imagination. They are walking a frayed tightrope over a canyon, and there is no net below them.
And the way the author conveys that tension brings us to the literary mastery of the text. We've talked about the history and the legal framework, but the survey really goes out of its way to emphasize that the Book of Ruth is a brilliantly crafted piece of literature. It's not just a dry historical log or a legal textbook.
Far from it. It is widely recognized by secular and biblical scholars alike as a highly crafted short story or a novella. It is rich with sophisticated literary devices. For instance, it uses heavy, deliberate repetition of key words to build themes. Words like return, redeem, and find favor echo constantly throughout the chapters.
Like a motif.
Exactly. It uses deep, tragic irony, like we mentioned with Bethlehem, the starving house of bread. It's also heavily dialogue-driven. The most crucial turning points in the narrative don't happen in action sequences or internal monologues. They happen during tense public speeches between characters.
The survey also spends time analyzing the structure, specifically mentioning something called chiasm. Now, for someone who isn't an English literature major, how does a chiasm work in an ancient text?
A chiasm is a specific literary structure where ideas or events are presented in a sequence and then repeated in reverse order. Think of it like a mirror reflection or a pyramid. The sequence goes A, B, C, and then C, B, A.
And the point at the top of the pyramid, the center of the chiasm, is the most important part.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The center point is the thematic hinge of the whole story. Now, the source notes that while scholars debate whether the entire Book of Ruth forms one perfect, unbroken chiasm, there's absolute consensus that the author uses incredible local symmetries and scene pairings to structure the narrative.
Right.
You have an opening scene of emptiness and a closing scene of fullness. You have a scene in a field at the beginning of the harvest and a scene at a threshing floor at the end of the harvest.
But the overarching literary motif, the engine that drives the whole emotional arc of the story, is this journey from absolute emptiness to abundant fullness.
Yes. In Hebrew, it's the movement from requam, which means empty, barren, or destitute, to male, which means full, satisfied, and abundant.
From requiem to male.
Exactly. And the first chapter of the book is an absolute masterclass in establishing that crushing emptiness.
It really is staggering to read. The survey points out how the narrator compresses an unimaginable amount of human tragedy into just 5 short verses. If you read verses 1 through 5 of chapter 1, it's like taking a barrage of punches. You have the initial famine, you have the desperate migration away from their homeland, you have the death of the father, you have the intermarriage with foreigners, which carries its own cultural tension, and then the ultimate blow, a triple widowhood.
3 deaths.
3 women left entirely alone. The narrative doesn't pause to let you grieve, it just states the facts, creating a stunning descent into total emptiness.
And that brutal compression forces the reader to confront the absolute devastation of the situation immediately. There is no lingering hope. Which brings us to the first major choice in the narrative.
Naomi's decision to leave.
Right. Naomi decides she has to return to Judah. She has heard a rumor that Yahweh has visited his people and given them food. The famine in Bethlehem is over. So she packs up to walk back. But she turns to her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, and she tells them to go back to their mother's houses in Moab.
She basically says, look, I have no more sons in my womb to give you as husbands. Even if I got pregnant tonight, are you going to wait 20 years for them to grow up? I have no future to offer you. Save yourselves.
It's a moment of brutal, rational realism. And this is where we see a divergence in the characters. The text says, Orpah wept, kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, and turned back to Moab. Ruth, however, clings to her.
I have to ask,
Because Orpah serves as the vital literary foil. By showing us how reasonable, expected, and logical Orpah's choice was, the text acts as a contrasting backdrop to highlight how astonishing, illogical, and expectation-breaking Ruth's choice to stay actually is.
I see.
Ruth's decision defies all economic and social sense. It is an act of radical, sacrificial covenant loyalty.
Which leads directly to one of the most famous poetic pledges in all of ancient literature. Even if you've never read the Bible, you've probably heard this quoted at a wedding. Ruth chapter 1, verses 16 and 17.
It's beautiful.
Ruth looks at Naomi and says, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried.
It is a breathtaking declaration. Think about what she is actually giving up. She is permanently severing ties with her homeland. She is abandoning her ethnic identity. She is leaving the religion of her ancestors. And she is binding herself with an oath of death to an old, bitter, impoverished widow who has explicitly told her there is no future.
You use the word bitter, and that is so central to Naomi's psychology in this chapter, because when Naomi and Ruth finally arrive back in Bethlehem after this long, arduous journey, the whole town comes out to see them.
Right.
The women of the village are buzzing. They say, is this Naomi? And Naomi's response is incredibly revealing about her state of mind. She exhibits this profound interpretive blindness.
She does. What does she tell them?
She tells the women of the town, do not call me Naomi. Now, the name Naomi in Hebrew means pleasant or lovely. She says, call me Mara, which means bitter.
Right.
And her reasoning is devastating. She says, I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty.
She interprets the entire reality of her life exclusively through the lens of her tragedy. She looks at her hands and sees nothing. She calls herself completely empty, utterly abandoned by God.
Yeah.
But the genius of the author here is that the narrator is winking at the audience. The reader knows something Naomi doesn't, because Naomi is completely missing 2 massive, glaring realities standing right in front of her face.
What is she missing?
Well, first, the text explicitly notes the timing of their arrival. It says they arrived in Bethlehem at the very beginning of the barley harvest. The famine that drove her away in the first place is over. The fields around her are literally golden and full of food. The stage is set for physical provision.
She is standing in a bakery complaining that she's starving.
Exactly. And second, and perhaps more tragically, she is completely ignoring the fact that standing right beside her, breathing the same air, is a fiercely loyal, courageous young woman who has just sworn an oath to stay with her until death.
Ruth is right there.
Right. Naomi says, God brought me back empty, while Ruth is standing right there. Naomi is entirely blinded by her grief. She cannot see that she is not actually empty.
She is so consumed by the loss of the past that she can't see the machinery of providence slowly starting to turn in the present, which creates the perfect bridge into the next phase of the story, the survival phase.
Right.
This brings us to chapter 2 of the text, which the survey titles Providence in the Field. Naomi and Ruth are back in Bethlehem, but they have no food in the pantry. So Ruth volunteers to go out into the fields to glean, to pick up the scraps we talked about earlier. And the narrator describes how she chooses a field.
The text says she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech.
Happened to come. I love that. It's such a wonderful piece of narrative irony.
It is the author loudly clearing their throat.
Yes, it's the narrator nudging the reader in the ribs. The text wants you to know that in a world without obvious miracles, this is not chance. It's not a coincidence that out of all the fields around Bethlehem, she walks into the specific one. It is divine providence.
Exactly.
God is quietly orchestrating the meeting behind the scenes. And this is where the narrative finally introduces us to Boaz.
And Boaz is a fascinating character study. He is introduced as a man of significant wealth and high social standing. But more importantly, from the very first moment he appears, he is introduced as a man who models profound personal integrity and protective leadership.
Yeah.
He rises at his field from the city, and the first thing he does is bless his workers in the name of Yahweh. And almost immediately his eyes land on Ruth.
He notices the outsider. He asks his foreman, whose young woman is this? And the foreman essentially says, oh, that's the Moabite girl who came back with Naomi. She's been working her fingers to the bone since morning. No. And Boaz takes immediate, decisive action to protect her. He goes over to Ruth and says, listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. He tells his male workers not to touch her or harass her. And he tells her that whenever she is thirsty, she can drink from the water jars his own workers have drawn.
He is extending the safety net far beyond what the law requires. And when Ruth, who is completely overwhelmed by this, bows down to the ground and asks him why he, powerful, wealthy Israelite landowner, is showing such favor to a foreign woman, Boaz gives a deeply revealing answer.
What does he say?
He replies that he has been fully informed of everything she has done for her mother-in-law since the death of her husband. He has heard how she left her parents and her native land to come to a people she did not know. He praises her loyalty. And this exchange is where we encounter one of the most crucial, load-bearing theological words in the entire Hebrew text.
Okay, let's unpack this. Here's where it gets really interesting. The survey spends a significant amount of time unpacking this single word, hesed. It's a thematic pillar for the whole book. It's used 3 times, in chapter 1, verse 8, chapter 2, verse 20, and chapter 3, verse 10. And the source warns us very strictly that when we translate this word into English, we cannot flatten it into mere sentimental niceness.
That is a critical distinction that modern readers often miss.
Yeah.
Hesed is not just being polite. It is not holding the door open for someone as in a warm, fuzzy feeling.
What is it?
Hesed is fierce, active, loyal love. It is covenant-keeping kindness. It is a stubborn, unbreakable commitment to the well-being of another person that goes far, far beyond what is legally, socially, or culturally required.
Wow.
When Ruth abandoned her homeland to care for a bitter old woman, that was hesed. It was costly. And now, Boaz is looking at Ruth, recognizing her hesed, and he is mirroring it right back to her.
Boaz pronounces this beautiful blessing over her. He says, may the Lord reward your work, and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge.
That specific imagery of the wings, the Hebrew word is kanaf, is deeply resonant in biblical theology. It evokes the image of a mother bird fiercely protecting her young under her wings, or the wings of the cherubim over the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
Boaz recognizes that Ruth, who is a complete outsider, a Moabite, has actively chosen to place herself under the protective, covenantal wings of Israel's God.
But what I love about Boaz is that he doesn't just offer spiritual platitudes. He doesn't just say, God bless you, and walk away. He backs up his theology with staggering material generosity.
Yes, he does.
When it's time to eat, he invites her to sit with his own workers and hands her roasted grain himself, so much that she has food left over. And then he secretly instructs his harvesters to deliberately pull out stalks of barley from the harvested bundles and leave them on the ground for her to glean.
He essentially rigs the system in her favor.
Right. By the end of the day, she beats out the grain she gathered, and it's an ephah of barley.
An ephah is an enormous volume of grain. It's roughly 30 to 50 pounds of barley.
That's heavy.
For a single person gleaning the margins, that is an impossible haul for one day. It represents weeks' worth of food for 2 women. It is a shocking, overwhelming abundance.
So you can imagine the scene. Ruth lugs this massive, heavy sack of grain back into town as the sun is setting. Naomi sees this mountain of food and her eyes are finally opened. The bitterness starts to crack.
Right.
She asks Ruth, where did you glean today? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. And when Ruth casually drops the name Boaz, the lights come on for Naomi. She suddenly realizes who this man is. She says, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead."
She finally sees the providence working in the background.
She tells Ruth, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers."
One of our goals. The emptiness is finally beginning to be filled. The fog of grief is lifting. But we have to realize that the situation for these two women is still incredibly precarious.
Why is that?
Yes, they have an abundance of food for today, and Boaz tells Ruth to glean in his fields until the end of the harvest. But they do not have structural security for tomorrow. The harvest only lasts a few weeks. Eventually, the fields will be bare. Winter will come. They need a permanent, legal solution if they are going to survive the long term.
So they have enough food for a few weeks. What happens when the grain runs out? How do they force a permanent solution? This catapults us directly into chapter 3 of the text, which the survey titles Risk at the Threshing Floor.
Yes.
Naomi's interpretive blindness has completely vanished. The bitter, passive woman from chapter 1 is gone. She suddenly goes on the offensive. She decides it's time to force the issue of redemption. She crafts a plan, and honestly, reading it today, it is a terrifyingly bold, dangerous plan.
It is a midnight, high-stakes maneuver that puts everything on the line. Naomi tells Ruth to wash herself, put on perfume, dress in her absolute best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor where Boaz is working.
Let's set the scene for the listener. What exactly is a threshing floor in the ancient agrarian world? Why is this setting so important?
A threshing floor was typically a hard, flat surface of rock or packed earth, usually located on an elevated ridge outside the village to catch the evening wind.
Okay.
After the stalks of grain were harvested, they were brought here. The farmers would beat the stalks or have oxen walk over them to loosen the edible grain from the inedible chaff. Then they would use pitchforks to throw the mixture into the air.
To let the wind touch it.
Exactly. The wind would blow the lighter chaff away, and the heavier grain would fall to the floor. It was a massive communal agricultural process.
But Naomi tells Ruth to go there at night.
Yes. During the day, it was a busy public workspace. But at night, after the exhausting work was done, the men would eat, drink, and celebrate the harvest. And then they would sleep right there on the threshing floor, physically guarding the piles of grain from thieves or wild animals.
So it's just men out there in the dark.
It became an exclusively male-dominated, unprotected space. For a young foreign widow to sneak down there alone in the middle of the night is an act of immense vulnerability and profound risk. If she is caught by the wrong person, her reputation is destroyed. Or worse, she could be assaulted.
But Naomi's instructions are incredibly specific. She tells Ruth to wait in the shadows until Boaz finishes eating and drinking and goes to sleep. She tells her to carefully note the exact place where he lies down at the end of the grain pile. And then she tells her to go over, uncover his feet, and lie down.
It's so bold.
And Ruth, showing incredible trust, does exactly that. She sneaks into the darkness, uncovers his feet, and lies there in the cold. Sometime around midnight, Boaz shivers, wakes up startled, leans forward, and finds a woman lying at his feet in the pitch dark.
A terrifying moment for him, probably.
Right. He asks, "Who are you?" And Ruth delivers what might be the most brilliant, loaded sentence in the whole book.
She responds, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer."
Spread your wings. She uses the exact same Hebrew word, kanaf, that Boaz used back in chapter 2 when he praised her for taking refuge under God's wings.
It is a breathtaking use of language. By asking him to spread his kanaf, a word which can translate to wings, but in a practical sense means the corner of a garment or the edge of a cloak over her, she is making a formal, culturally recognized request for marital redemption.
Wow.
She is turning his own theology back onto him. She's essentially saying, "You told me I was blessed for seeking shelter under God's protective wings. Now I'm asking you to be the physical, earthly embodiment of that divine protection. Do your legal duty as a Goel. Marry me, spread your cloak over me, and redeem our family from this emptiness."
It is an incredibly assertive, aggressive move for a woman in that culture. But we have to tackle something the survey addresses head-on under its major interpretive issues section. Is this scene scandalous? Because from the outside looking in, you have a young, beautiful woman bathing, putting on perfume, and sneaking into a wealthy older man's bed at midnight on a remote threshing floor. It sounds exactly like the setup for an illicit, scandalous affair.
This is a point of heavy debate among scholars, and the source material provides a very balanced, nuanced analysis of the tension. The text is undeniably deliberately suggestive.
It wants you to think that.
The author is intentionally playing with the reader's expectations. It uses language that is highly rhetorically charged. For instance, the phrase, uncover his feet. In various parts of the Hebrew Bible, the word feet is sometimes used as a euphemism for genitalia, and the act of a man spreading his cloak over a woman is a euphemism for the consummation of marriage.
So the author is walking right up to the line of scandal. The reader is supposed to be holding their breath, wondering if this is going to turn into a story of exploitation or seduction.
Exactly. The tension is the point. However, the expert consensus highlighted in the survey is clear. The text does not explicitly describe sexual intercourse happening on the threshing floor.
Okay.
While scholars disagree on the exact degree of erotic ambiguity intended by the author, the narrative ultimately drives toward a completely different, much higher moral conclusion.
Right.
The tension is resolved not by a scandalous act, but by a display of profound character. Boaz does not take advantage of her vulnerability. He doesn't act like one of the warlords from the Book of Judges who simply takes what he wants. Instead, his response is one of awe, respect, and deep honor.
He is actually moved by it. He praises her again for her desert. He says, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich." He recognizes that she isn't acting out of lust or gold digging. She deliberately sought out the older, legally appointed Redeemer purely to save Naomi's family line. It's an act of duty.
And in response to that duty, he gives her an incredible title. He calls her an Eshet Chayil.
Which translates to a woman of valor, right?
Exactly. And the source points out that we need to understand the weight of that phrase. It is an active, incredibly strong term. It's the exact same phrase used to describe the ideal, industrious woman at the end of Proverbs 31.
Oh, interesting.
Historically, the root word chayil is a military term. It's often applied to mighty warriors or men of wealth and power. Boaz is not viewing Ruth as a passive, helpless victim. And he certainly isn't viewing her as a scandalous temptress.
He sees her strength.
He is looking at a foreign widow sitting on a threshing floor in the middle of the night, and he is addressing her as a fiercely loyal, courageous warrior of deep integrity. He promises her, "Do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman of valor."
It's a beautiful moment of mutual respect, but just when you think the story is wrapped up with a neat little bow, the author drops a massive cliffhanger.
A catastrophic complication for their plan.
Yeah.
Boaz agrees that he's a redeemer, but he reveals a legal reality that Naomi apparently didn't know or didn't factor in. Boaz says, "It is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I."
There is another male relative who is closer in the family tree.
Yes, and legally, this other closer relative has the absolute right of first refusal. Boaz cannot legally marry Ruth, and he cannot redeem Elimelech's land unless this closer relative formally, legally, steps aside and renounces his claim.
So Ruth stays the rest of the night, but leaves before dawn so no one sees her and starts a rumor that could ruin the legal proceedings. Boaz sends her away with another huge load of barley, 6 measures this time, so she won't go back to Naomi empty-handed. But the fate of the entire family, all the tension built up over 3 chapters, now rests on a legal technicality that has to be resolved by a man we've never even met. Which brings us to the climax of the story. Chapter 4, The City Gate.
The narrative shifts immediately from the hidden, risky, intimate environment of the threshing floor at midnight to the very public, well-lit, highly formal environment of the city gate in the morning.
Total change of scenery.
In the ancient Near East, the city gate wasn't just a physical door and a wall. It was the courthouse. It was the town square. It was a civic center where all official, legal, economic, and political business was publicly transacted. Boaz goes straight to the gate, sits down, and waits.
And sure enough, the nearer Redeemer happens to walk by. Boaz flags him down and says, "Turn aside, friend. Sit down here." Boaz then gathers 10 elders of the city to sit down as well, acting as an official jury and a binding witness pool. And the survey points out a brilliant, almost petty literary slight in the Hebrew text right at this moment.
It is fantastic narrative shade.
It really is.
The author deliberately refuses to give this nearer Redeemer a name. Throughout the entire legal proceeding, the narrator and Boaz refer to him in the Hebrew idiom, Poloni Armoni.
Which translates roughly to Mr. So-and-so or the unnamed so-and-so.
Exactly, John Doe. Now, you have to ask, why would the narrator strip this man of his name? In a culture that values genealogy and legacy above almost everything else, anonymity is an insult.
It's the ultimate punishment.
The reason becomes clear when you watch how the legal chess match unfolds. Boaz is a master tactician. He initially presents the situation to Mr. So-and-so purely as a real estate transaction. He says, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. He asks Mr. So-and-so if he wants to exercise his right to redeem it.
And Mr. So-and-so doesn't hesitate. He says, yes, I will redeem it. From his perspective, it's a great investment. He buys the land, adds it to his own existing estate, increases his wealth, and looks like a good guy doing it.
It's a win-win for him. But then Boaz springs the trap. He drops the hammer. Boaz says, oh, by the way, the day you buy the fields from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance.
He links the redemption of the land to the levirate duty of marrying Ruth. He intertwines the two laws we discussed earlier.
And suddenly, the economic math completely changes for Mr. So-and-so.
Right.
If he just buys the land, he keeps it. But if he has to marry Ruth, and they have a son, that son will legally carry Elimelech's name, not Mr. So-and-so's name.
Oh, wow.
And that son will inherit Elimelech's land. So the money Mr. So-and-so spends today to buy the land will eventually be lost to his own estate, and the land will go to Ruth's child, diluting the inheritance of his own existing children.
The risk is too high. The cost of his asset is too steep for him.
Exactly. He looks at the jury of elders and says, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it.
He backs out. He plays it safe. He chooses to protect his own assets, his own family, and his own comfortable life rather than risk it all to save a vulnerable widow. And this perfectly explains why the author calls him unnamed so-and-so. I look at it like looking back through history. The people who play it safe, who refuse to take risks, who stick strictly to the letter of the law but lack the spirit of generosity, they are forgotten by history. Their names fade into dust. But those who take incredibly costly risks for the sake of others, who show radical hissit, like Boaz and Ruth, they get their names carved in stone. They get an entire book of scripture named after them.
That is precisely the moral judgment embedded right into the grammar of the story. The text is arguing that mere legal compliance without covenant generosity, without haste, is fundamentally insufficient. It preserves your bank account, but it erases your name.
So powerful.
Boaz immediately accepts the responsibility. He announces to the elders and all the people at the gate that he has legally acquired the right to buy the land of Elimelech and to take Ruth the Moabite as his wife, specifically to perpetuate the name of the dead.
And the response from the community is incredible. The elders and the people at the gate act as witnesses, and they pronounce a massive prophetic blessing over Ruth. They ask God to make her like Rachel and Leah, the two matriarchs who literally built up the house of Israel.
It is a stunning reversal of chapter 1. The foreign, destitute, grieving widow who came back empty is now being publicly equated with the founding mothers of the entire Israelite nation.
How beautiful.
And the resolution of this story happens very rapidly after that legal victory. Boaz marries Ruth. They conceive a child, but the text doesn't just say they had a baby. It is very specific in its phrasing. It says, the Lord gave her conception. God is explicitly named as the one who brings life out of this decade-long barrenness.
She gives birth to a son named Obed. And the women of Bethlehem, who have acted almost like a Greek chorus throughout this entire story, from commenting on Naomi's bitter return to this moment, they surround Naomi. They declare that God has not left her without a redeemer. They say this child will be a restorer of life and a nourisher of her old age. And then they say something that would have been shocking in that patriarchal culture. They tell Naomi that her daughter-in-law, Ruth, who loves her, is more to you than 7 sons.
In the ancient Near East, having 7 sons was the ultimate hyperbole of value and security. It was the pinnacle of blessing. The women are saying that this one foreign woman's loyal love is worth more than the greatest imaginable societal wealth.
Unbelievable.
The woman who came back claiming to be completely empty is now holding a grandson in her lap, surrounded by a community that loves her. The journey from emptiness, requiem, to fullness, male, is complete.
But the narrative doesn't end with a warm family portrait. It takes a massive step back. It zooms out from the microscope view. It takes this intimate micro-history of a vulnerable family in a small, dusty village and suddenly connects it to the grand, sweeping horizon of salvation history. The book ends with a very formal genealogy.
Right. Now, these are the generations of Perez, down to Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David.
King David.
King David, the greatest king in Israel's history. The man who will eventually unite the warring tribes, secure the land, write the Psalms, and establish the royal dynasty from which the Messiah will eventually come.
It is a mind-blowing reveal. It reframes the entire story. So what does this all mean? We've walked through the history, the law, and the literature. We see how the pieces fit together, but let's synthesize this. Let's look at the big theological and contemporary themes the survey draws out of this text. What does this all mean for the reader?
If we look at the theology of the book, what stands out most prominently is the hiddenness of God. We talked about this briefly, but it deserves deep focus.
Yeah, let's get into it.
Unlike the book of Exodus, where God is parting the Red Sea and speaking audibly from burning bushes, or the book of Joshua, where the walls of Jericho are supernaturally falling down, God doesn't perform any flashy, physics-defying miracles in the book of Ruth. There are no thunderclaps. There are no angelic visitations.
God is operating entirely behind the scenes. He is the quiet director of the play.
Yes. The theology here shows God working providentially through incredibly mundane, everyday events. He works through a shifting weather pattern that ends a famine. He works through a young woman's arbitrary decision about which field to glean in.
Just happening to end up there.
Exactly. He works through a man waking up startled in the middle of the night. He works through the dry legal ruling of a village council. He works through human bravery and human hyssnd. The text argues that God's massive, world-altering providence is intimately interwoven with ordinary human obedience.
The source material also dives into how this book points forward. It discusses a Christ-centered typology for the book. Now, it notes that Ruth points to Christ through pattern rather than through direct, heavy-handed proof texting. For someone trying to understand the theological architecture of the Bible, what does that mean?
It means we shouldn't force one-to-one allegories where they don't belong. Boaz is not literally Jesus in disguise, but we should recognize the profound redemptive patterns that the text is establishing.
The overarching themes.
Right. Boaz perfectly models the pattern of the goal, the Redeemer. He's the one who has both the desire and the financial and legal means to rescue the vulnerable who cannot save themselves. Throughout history, theologians have looked at Boaz and seen a type, a foreshadowing of Christ as the ultimate Redeemer who steps in to rescue humanity from the ultimate bankruptcy of sin and death.
That makes perfect sense.
Furthermore, the narrative arc of the empty house being filled with life directly parallels the gospel message of restoration.
And crucially, there is the massive theme of outsider inclusion, the grace extended to the marginalized.
Absolutely. We cannot overstate this. Ruth is a Moabite by birth, by geography, and by ethnicity. She is outside the covenant of Israel. According to the strict reading of some laws in Deuteronomy, Moabites were excluded from the assembly.
But she gets in.
But through her faith-filled allegiance to Yahweh, her radical hizad, she is brought into the very center of the covenant community. She anticipates the inclusion of the Gentiles, the outsiders, into the people of God. The lines of who belongs are redrawn around faith and loyalty, not just bloodlines.
Wow.
In fact, if you fast forward and read the very first chapter of the New Testament, Matthew chapter 1, which lists the genealogy of Jesus Christ, Ruth's name is explicitly listed right there in verse 5.
Think about that. An ancient, impoverished immigrant widow from a rival nation is permanently etched into the messianic family tree. It completely subverts all human expectations of who matters in the grand scheme of things. It flips the pyramid upside down.
Entirely.
And that brings us to the contemporary relevance of the source material. The survey argues very convincingly that this ancient text speaks directly to some very modern, very real issues we still face today.
It does. The ancient world is not as far away as we think. The source points out that the Book of Ruth resonates deeply with modern issues of migration and displacement. We're dealing with a family that is forced to cross international borders because of a severe ecological disaster.
Right.
We are dealing with a woman who immigrates to a new country and faces intense systemic vulnerability. It speaks to female economic vulnerability, the realities of poverty, and the unseen labor of caregiving.
The text seems to pose a direct challenge to how societies organize themselves. The notes argue that the text challenges communities, both ancient and modern, that highly value purity language or rigid ethnic exclusivity, but completely neglect the actual vulnerable people standing right in their midst.
Exactly. The story insists that legal structures, whether it's the ancient laws of the goal and gleaning or modern legal safety nets, exist fundamentally to serve life. They exist to protect the weak and to foster flourishing.
Not just to look good on paper.
Right. They do not exist simply to enforce rigid procedural compliance or to protect the assets of the wealthy, which is exactly the trap Mr. So-and-so fell into. He followed the letter of the law, but violated the spirit of he said.
It's a powerful challenge. It essentially says that true covenant faithfulness, true morality, is proved by how a society treats its most marginalized, easily forgotten members. The widow, the orphan, the immigrant, the poor. If your legal system works for the landowners but lets the gleaners starve, your system is failing.
It is a profound standard to be judged against.
It is a lot to chew on. Let's recap this incredible journey we've taken today through the text. We started with an ecological disaster, a famine in the house of bread that drove a desperate family into a foreign land. We watched as a cascade of death stripped Naomi of everything she had, leaving her utterly empty, unprotected, and bitter.
A total loss.
But we also witnessed an act of astonishing, logic-defying loyalty from a Moabite widow named Ruth, who refused to let her grieving mother-in-law walk alone into the dark.
We saw how that single act of loyalty led them back to Bethlehem, where they relied on the fragile legal safety nets of gleaning just to survive. We saw the quiet, invisible providence of God guiding Ruth's steps into the field of Boaz, a man who possessed the power to exploit her, but instead chose to mirror her hells with his own extravagant, generous protection.
We felt the palpable tension of a midnight, high-risk encounter on a threshing floor, where a bold, dangerous request for redemption was made under the cover of darkness. We sat at the city gate in the morning light and watched a complex legal chess match unfold, exposing the difference between safe legalism and costly generosity.
Yeah. And ultimately, we saw how the birth of a single child, Obed, turned a decade of emptiness into overflowing fullness, and quietly laid the ancestral foundation for the greatest king in Israel's history.
It is a reminder that the most insignificant people and the most out-of-the-way places are often the hinges upon which history turns.
It truly is. Before we wrap up, I want to circle back to how we started this conversation. We talked about looking at history through a telescope versus a microscope. We are trained to expect the sweeping epics, the kings, the battles, and the blockbusters. But the Book of Ruth forces us to put down the telescope and look through the microscope at the margins of society.
And the view through that microscope is paradigm shifting. As we finish up our time, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you step back into your own life.
In a world that is utterly obsessed with loud, visible, top-down power, a world that tells you that you only matter if you have wealth, status, or influence, the Book of Ruth suggests something entirely different. It suggests that the grand, sweeping arcs of history, and perhaps the most important world-altering movements of divine providence, are completely dependent on the small, unseen, and often very costly choices we make to protect the vulnerable people standing right in front of us.
It changes how you see the people around you. It makes you realize that the everyday choices of kindness you make might have generational echoes you will never see. So ask yourself, who is gleaning in your field right now? Who is standing on the margins of your life, relying on the scraps, waiting for someone to spread their wings over them?
That's the question we all need to answer.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the historical, literary, and theological world of Ruth. It has been an absolute pleasure to unpack this masterpiece with you. Until next time, keep digging, keep learning, and keep looking for the history being made in the quiet margins.